Christopher Edge is an award-winning children's author, with his books already translated into more than 20 languages. His novel, The Many Worlds of Albie Bright, was one of our selections in the very first Reading Gladiators programme, and it won several children's book awards. It was also nominated for the Philip Carnegie Medal, as was his novel, The Jamie Drake Equation. His other books include the critically acclaimed 12 Minutes to Midnight series, and Christopher has also written inspirational guides to creative writing for children and teenagers. Christopher met recently with Nikki Gamble to talk about his latest title, The Longest Night of Charlie Noon.
Very excited to be talking to you about this book today, and it's one that completes a sequence of 4 books, all featuring different characters, but connected by a thread with an interest in physics that underpins all of them. I wonder if you could just put the latest novel in context and tell us how they relate to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I've jokingly, Alan Garner had the Stone Book Quartet, so I jokingly refer to this now as the IE Quartet, because the character names always end in IE in the first name. So it started kind of back with The Many Worlds of Albie Bright, which was a book it's a story about a boy called Albie who loses his mother to cancer, and then finds out about the parallel world theory in quantum physics, and then goes on a journey into different parallel worlds to search for her. So I always describe it as it's a wonderful life with quantum physics. And then after that, it then led on to the Jamie Drake Equation, which is a story inspired around about the time when Tim Peake was up on the International Space Station, but it's about a boy whose dad was an astronaut searching for alien life, and the boy finding alien life much closer to home, but using that idea to tell a story about families and the different shapes that they can come in, and our relationships with our parents and things. A bit about that part of childhood where you discover the failures of your family for the first time and things. And then it led into The Infinite Lives of Maisie Day, which I think is my most scientific book, which is a book about a girl called Maisie and the story of her 10th birthday. And Maisie was a bit of a child prodigy, very gifted and talented when it came to science and maths. But it told the story of her 10th birthday in a split narrative. One narrative exploring her ordinary birthday with her family and her older sister Lily and the relationship she had with her, and the second narrative that explored her birthday when she basically wakes up and opens the front door to find an infinite blackness outside her house, and it takes a stranger turn from there. So there were also all 3 of those previous novels were stories that were the contemporary and stories that use science and ideas of science to tell stories about love and loss and family and basically what it meant to be human. And with The Longest Night of Charlie Noon, I think it's a novel that's again informed by science, but I think the science is very much holding up the scenery of this. You might not find it on the page so much, but it's there in the story.
Because you could read this, the reason that I'm reading the science into it, if you like, is because I'm reading it in the context of the other novels. Had I read it on its own first, I might just be reading it as out of the genre of a time slip story.
Yes, I think that's fair enough. I think people might bring certain expectations to Charlie Noon and might find those expectations challenged in some ways, or they might, because they have that expectation from my other books, especially maybe with the twists that they found in Maisie Day. I don't know. It's very interesting. I'm at that stage of waiting to see what people will make of it.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. But of course, you haven't always written about science. Your other wonderful series with the Penny Dreadfuls is quite different. So it's not that you only write about science. Let's stick with the science for a moment, though, and turn to your interest in physics. I've heard you talk, and I have to say I heard you talk only recently to a group of student teachers, and I'm still getting emails from and messages from students who were completely mind-boggled at that event and absolutely thrilled with your presentation. And you come across as though you've been involved in the world of physics all your life, and you're an expert in this. So where does that interest come from?
Well, as you know, Nikki, from hearing me speak to those student teachers, it doesn't come from my school experience, because I actually got a grade D in my GCSE physics exam. And science at school for me kind of was quite dull. I remember, rolling marbles down slopes and boiling slightly salty water. That's basically my memory of science at school. I loved reading science fiction. I loved comics like 2000 AD. I loved stories by writers like Arthur C. Clarke and John Christopher and people. But it's mainly in later life, watching programs like Professor Brian Cox's series on the wonders of the universe, and reading books of popular science. What I like is that sense of wonder I find in science nowadays, and the things I read. I think every author has a brain that just basically leads them to find stories in everything, and reading books about quantum physics and parallel universes just activates a certain point in my brain, and I'll read things, and just sentences or theories will jump out at me. I think I'll see the kind of seed of a story in there.
And how deep does your research go for these books? I mean, are you scouring New Scientist?
I do read New Scientist. Yes, I basically, what I love about being an author is it's just an excuse to get interested in whatever you want to get interested in. I do tend to research these books quite intensively. So for the book like The Infinite Lives of Maisie Day, I was reading lots of theories, quite esoteric scientific theories about things like the holographic universe, this idea that the universe that we live in might only be a two-dimensional projection from another universe. All kind of things that kind of do lead you to question your place in the universe, which is not the best motivation when you've got a deadline to write a book. But it's always been important to me that the science I put in my stories is real. Some people, I think, some authors use this as a jumping off point, but for me, I kind of like the truthfulness. I don't want to bend the science to fit the story. I want the two things to cohere, because I think that gives a realism to the stories. And I mean, that's always been the case. So when I was writing the 12 Minutes to Midnight series that you mentioned, which are historical kind of mysteries, every single character in those books outside of the main protagonist was based on a real figure from history. So even people who just wandered on for a page or two. So it's always kind of the truthfulness has always been important to me.
So it sounds like a part of the writing process that you enjoy actually is the research, that in some ways that's exciting for you. Do you feel that you have to really understand it? Because some of these concepts are really hard.
Yes, that's been the problem, not the problem, but kind of I have to understand it enough to then be able to write about it, but write about it in the context of fiction, not kind of just dropping facts in there. I have to write about it in a sense that helps me to tell the story, and then be aware that the readers of my story might be as young as 9-10 years old. But to be honest, going out into schools and speaking to children at festivals, etc., really, I think they've got the more open minds to be able to deal with those concepts. So I have the questions they ask when I go. It leads me to believe that they're maybe more ready. I think maybe the school curriculum's the wrong way around, and they only get to do quantum physics when they study it at university. But maybe we should start at Key Stage 1.
Perhaps we'll come to younger children in a little while. But I think you touched on something really interesting then. In a sense, I think you have to understand it even more to write fiction than non-fiction, because you can't just go into exposition, so it has to stand up to a different kind of scrutiny.
Yes, and especially with these books that I've written, which are first-person narratives, it's you're hearing a character's understanding or questioning of these ideas. So it's not my understanding or my questioning of these ideas. It's coming through the prism of the character, which might vary. So the character of Albie is a very different character to the character of Maisie and Maisie Day, and similarly in Charlie Noon, the character of Charlie is completely different. It's a very different worldview from the protagonists of the novels that have gone before.
I wonder, to lead us into Charlie Noon so we can talk about it in a little bit more depth, whether you'd read a little bit for us, perhaps from the beginning.
Yeah, so this is from the very opening of the novel. I tricked myself last time. With The Infinite Lives of Maisie Day, I had a chapter 0, which I think was me resisting the idea of writing a prologue. But in The Longest Night of Charlie Noon, I have actually written a prologue, so I'll read that for you now. Once upon a time, 3 kids got lost in the woods. Sounds like a fairy story, doesn't it? But what exactly is a time? Is it a second, a minute, an hour, or a day? Or are we talking about a week, a month, a year, maybe even a lifetime? A blink of an eye lasts for the 10th of a second, while scientists reckon that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. Tick, tick, tick. Can I tell you a secret? Once upon a time doesn't exist. This story starts once upon a now.
Brilliant. I have to say, listening to you read that again, having read the book, I've got goosebumps on the back of my arms as you read that. It means something different once you've got to the end of the book, or it means something more once you've got to the end of the book. Let's just set up the story without giving away too much to the listener. Can you just tell us a little bit about the story?
Well, it's the story about 3 children, Charlie, Dizzy and Johnny, Charlie and Dizzy are friends, and Dizzy tells Charlie at school one day that he's found some, what he thinks are secret messages left on the path in the woods, kind of the sticks arranged almost like in a code. And they decide to go to school. Johnny overhears them talking about this, and they decide to go into the woods after school to investigate this. Johnny says that the sticks have been left by somebody called Old Crony, who he says is a monster who lives in the woods. And when they go into the woods after school, they're trying to find out what it is. Who has left these sticks? Is it spies? Is it a monster? But when they go into the woods, suddenly night falls without warning, and they start to get impossibly lost, and lots of strange dangers and impossible puzzles are kind of found, and it almost feels like time's playing tricks on them as they make their journey through the woods.
It has to be said, it's quite discombobulating to begin with until you start to unravel the mystery, because it is a mystery story, really, isn't it, as well? You've talked a little bit about your interest in science, but you're writing fiction, and I wondered at what point the story came in here and you knew you were going to be writing the story about these 3 children. When did those 2 things come together?
I think every story comes out of what's happening in the world around you, in a way, and this story kind of came out of the time that we're living in now, which is a time where there's lots of what feels like political instability. There's with things like Brexit and rising hate crime and things like this, it seems like a world where it's almost that we're taking a darker path at the moment. And someone who grew up in the I was born in 1974, and someone who kind of grew up in the 1980s, under the shadow of the Cold War and fears of nuclear war and things like that, reading stories like Blood in the Land and Z for Zechariah at school. I think the stories that you like kind of come out of the times in which you live, and The Longest Night of Charlie Noon, in a way, has come out of this the feeling about the world that we're living in now, and the fact that sometimes you'll, as a child, you overhear conversations and you hear things you don't properly understand that speaks of people's fears, and it's kind of exploring those childhood fears. We often romanticize childhood as a golden time filled with carefree days, climbing trees. But when you're a child, you can often feel powerless and can't wait to grow up. So in Charlie Noon, I wanted to kind of explore, kind of write a story about someone who feels lost, not just in the woods, but in their life and their home situation and things. And through the story, Charlie finds reserves of bravery. She kind of finds insights, and it kind of I wanted to kind of send a message back to those people, to those leaders who are having hard times, or whose child isn't the golden time, to say there's a way through.
Yeah, I think children and adults reading your book will have slightly different experiences reading it, and one of the things that I kind of recognise in the stories are your connections, your literary connections that feed through. Tell us a little bit about those. I mean, well, there's one book that I won't mention because that might give too much away. But for instance, I got a hint of Tom's Midnight Garden. You reference Wind in the Willows. How important are these literary connections to you?
I think they're very important. I mean, every writer is. I think the stories that everyone writes is we're all standing on the shoulders of all the books that we've read, have led us to be in the position to be able to write stories. So, I feel very privileged to be a writer of children's fiction because there's such a rich tradition of children's fiction. So, the fact that you're kind of mentioning stories like Tom's Midnight Garden is great, because I kind of would love The Longest Night of Charlie Noon to be seen in that tradition. There's a book that's probably a bit of a forgotten children's book called Brendan Chase by B.B., who's someone who's writing kind of in the 1940s. He wrote a story called The Little Grey Men that won the Carnegie Medal. And Brendan Chase is a book he wrote which is about 3 boys who spend a summer in the woods, living out in the woods, run away from their aunt's house and spend the entire summer living in the woods. And it's quite an idyllic story. And he writes beautifully about the natural world. And in The Longest Night of Charlie Noon, I reread that in between writing the first and second drafts of the story, and I realised when I reread Brendan Chase how, in some weird ways, The Longest Night of Charlie Noon was kind of a strange tribute to Brendan Chase, even though the characters only spend a single night in the woods.
That's fascinating. Jane Nissan brought that book back into print temporarily. I think that's
like Philip Pullman wrote an introduction. I think that's the edition I've got. I've got the introduction by Philip Pullman.
Fantastic.
Actually, and he kind of inspired. Actually, I've got a copy of that. Actually, just let me grab it. So I think in Philip Pullman's introduction, he actually set a challenge for me.
Right.
So in the first line of his introduction, he said, "This is the sort of book that will never be written again."
Right. So you took that.
I've taken that challenge.
You took that baton. Have you sent your book to Philip Pullman?
I don't know if I have, actually. I think I'd love to. Because my very first literary festival I ever did was I appeared on stage with Philip Pullman at the Oxford Literary Festival, which is very intimidating, but he was very generous in his time and the way he treated. There's myself and another Dave York on stage alongside him at the Oxford Literary Festival. So I would love to send him a copy of The Longest Night of Charlie Noon.
There we go. There are other things that I think must interest you greatly. The idea of code is quite a strong theme through Charlie Noon as well. It's not just the Morse code, but there are other codes that come in too. Were you a code breaker as a child? Do you do lots of puzzles, or was that research just for this book?
No. Again, it's just something that I had to. There's a very important reason. Charlie is someone who's very good at puzzle solving and solving codes, and it's very important for. There's a special reason why Charlie's so good at that, or there's a reason where that leads Charlie. But I'm rubbish at codes, and I'm okay at crosswords, but I bought one of those. I think those GCHQ puzzle books were very big a couple of Christmases ago, and I bought one, but I decided to do something. So it's something that I've had to research and find out about, and the history of codes is amazing. And I'm actually going to be doing an event at the Royal Institution in June. It's called The Longest Night of Charlie Noon at the Royal Institution, and it's going to be myself talking about the book, but there's also going to be a guy called Tom there who's from Bletchley Park, who will be kind of demonstrating an Enigma machine and talking about codes and code breaking, and there's also going to be an astrophysicist there, Amelie, who's going to be talking about stars. Yeah.
You know, I just have got to tell the listeners that you impressed me considerably with your Morse code last week at the Edge Hill event. But then I think you told me that it was just an app that was doing it. Is that right?
Yes, I'm currently kind of working out, because we're just a few weeks away from publication, and I've got several events coming up. I'm kind of working out what my event for the Longest Night of Charlie Noon is. So there's going to be some code breaking in there. So I've downloaded an app that allows me to type in any text into my phone, and it then plays it back as Morse code. So I'm feverishly typing in "buy my book." Subliminal Morse code advertising. Yeah, it's a new thing.
Very clever. Subliminal advertising. I know that with your other books that you've had a playlist when you've been writing. Is that something that you did for Charlie Noon as well?
It was, yes. So there is going to be a playlist for The Longest Night of Charlie Noon. I always choose songs that kind of remind me, because when I'm writing a book, I can't listen to any music at all. I need kind of to hear the rhythm of the sentences in my head. And if I listen to music, even ambient music, it distracts me from the story. But when I'm not writing, I like to listen to songs, and sometimes I'll listen to songs and they'll kind of remind me of moments in the story. So it's almost a way of staying in the world of the story, even when I'm not writing. So there's a playlist, kind of a chapter by chapter. Each chapter in the book has a song that goes with it, and it starts off with, I'll give you a sneak preview, it starts off with Wildwood by Paul Weller, but the Portishead remix.
So Wildwood, of course, they are in a wildwood, and there's the reference to Wind in the Willows in there as well, with Mole getting lost in the wildwood too. Let's just come back before we go into a second reading to the concept of time, which is a major theme in Charlie Noon. What did you discover about the theory of time and how we experience time when you were thinking about this book?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I think there's so much great. I think, time as a theme is a real tradition of children's literature. You've mentioned things like Tom's Midnight Garden. There's A Stitch in Time by Penelope Lively. There's the books of Alan Garner, which kind of explore the notions of deep time. And people often think, when I started writing these kind of stories, people often characterise The Many Worlds of Albie Bright as a time travel story, and it's not. It's a story about a boy who travels into parallel universes, and people, that's less known, so people think, oh, he's time travelling, but it's not. I think the time travel stories, things like Doctor Who are great, but they don't really fit with what science suggests about time. And so by actually reading a lot of books about time, there's lots of different theories. Time is one of the most mind-boggling. It's the aspect of the universe that we all experience. We're both sitting here talking to each other, and we're sitting still, so we're at a fixed point in space, but we cannot stop time. Time is flowing either around us or through us, or we're moving with time. And that notion of time and our experience of time, it was a real element that fed into The Longest Night of Charlie Noon. There's a theory called the block universe, which some scientists think that all of time and space exists simultaneously. So, there's these moments in time, myself when I was 6 years old and fell over on the playground at school in Eccles, Manchester, and myself sitting here now, and myself in 5 years in the future. All those moments in space and time exist simultaneously. So that was one of the ideas that I liked that played into The Longest Night of Charlie Noon. Whether I believe that's true is I'm not sure, but it's an interesting thing to play with.
It's interesting. I find that easier to grasp than some of the other theories to do with, just how the infinity and how the universe began. That's huge. But the notion of all times existing simultaneously, you promised to tell me about your understanding of déjà vu.
Right. So yeah, there's a guy. So this is, another author I read when I was writing The Longest Night of Charlie Noon is J.B. Priestley, whose plays obviously Inspector Calls, Time the Conways deal with notions of time, and he was influenced. I'm not going to be able to remember the guy's name now. There was a writer back in, I think, the interwar period, who came up with this notion of, it was kind of like the block universe, but slightly different. So he used déjà vu as evidence for this idea that these different moments in time all exist simultaneously. So and he thought that when you dreamt, you were maybe floating free of the river of time, this flow of time, and being able to see these different moments that exist. And that's what generates déjà vu.
I think it is a fascinating concept, and it's one that our concept of time is one that constantly changes, I think, as we grow older, not only in terms of how we experience time, but also our understanding of things like how it's measured, and what chronology means. And then, of course, when you come to think about writing a story, a narrative by and large happens in a chronological line and smooths things out as though they have beginnings and endings.
Yes. But I think when we read, we think that we read linear narratives, but we don't. When we read a novel, often there'll be flashbacks and moments and things. So you never read. It's interesting because my most recent novels have all been written in the first person present tense, and that's another reason why in The Longest Night of Charlie Noon there's a specific reason why it's written in the first person present tense, because as in that reading before, I said, this story starts once upon a now. That is how we experience the universe. We experience everything in the present, and the present is perpetually just flickering in and out of existence. What I've just said now is in the past, and that notion of stories being this straight line is, I think that's a fiction too, because I think when we read a novel, we'll respond to it, and it'll have an emotional effect on us. But also, I think you create, it's interesting, I've just read the novel All Among the Barley by Melissa Harrison, which is an adult novel, and I found it very deeply affecting. It's strangely got some parallels with The Longest Night of Charlie Noon in some ways, but one of the things I've taken away from that novel, I'm kind of slightly grieving, that process of grieving you have when you finish a book sometimes, and I'm kind of grieving for the the character and the life that I'd like to have imagined for them. And I think that's the thing in fiction sometimes, and that was another element I liked to try to play in to The Longest Night of Charlie Noon, is this notion that you get a segment of a character's life, the segment that the author has chosen to present you in a story. And often one of the joys of reading, and you look at something like Harry Potter, and the way that J.K. Rowling went back to those characters in the Cursed Child play to show those characters as parents now, which is a very unusual thing to have happened, to have protagonists who were children in a series novel and then appear the same characters as adults. And I think when we respond to characters, we almost want to imagine what the rest of their lives will be like. When in the Pride and Prejudice, it'd be interesting, going back to those characters 10 years down the line or something. And I think she does that, doesn't she? I think does she mention that at the end of the novel?
I think so. I can't quite recall now, but I think you could be right. And some people, that does sometimes happen in novels, doesn't it? And sometimes in film too. What happened 5 years on or 10 years on?
Yeah, and I think I'm just thinking of recent. Kieran Millward Hargrave does that in The Island at the End of Everything, where there's a little section at the end where I don't want to spoil the story for anyone, but the main character meets her childhood friends again as adults in a different situation.
That's right, and of course that is what Philippa Pierce does too in Tom's Midnight Garden. That's really central to that story. I wonder whether we could hear a second reading from the book.
Yeah, so this is from the past story where Charlie has just fallen, and she's deciding that she wants to get out of the woods now. I glanced down at my watch, wanting to find out exactly what time it is. The hour and the minute hand are both stuck pointing downwards, telling me it's 6:30. But the second hand that should be ticking on is stuck there too. It must have stopped. I try winding the watch, but the hands refuse to move. It must have got broken when I fell. Something else to explain to Mum and Dad, along with the bloodstains on my shirt and the bandage wrapped around my head. I'm going to be in so much trouble. I look up. The light seems to be failing. The scattered patches of sky I can see now tinged with pink and orange. Dusk is slowly seeping through the leaves, filling the woods with a rising darkness. It feels much later than 6:30. In my mind, I can see Dad sitting at the kitchen table, more empty bottles lined up in front of him now as he watches the clock go round. The jangling pain beneath my bandage makes me feel sick to my stomach. It's time to face the music. Come on, I say to Dizzy. Let's go home.
Wow. And they are in for quite a night, it has to be said. And I think we've managed to talk about The Longest Night of Charlie Noon without giving away too many clues that are going to spoil it for people who are going to read the book. I'd like to know what's next on the cards for you, Chris. What are you going to be delighting us with next time?
I'm not sure yet. I'm at that strange kind of moment where there's several things flying around my head and I'm just trying to decide which one to pursue. I always like the way that one of the people I never speak about as an influence, but who is a massive influence on me, is Russell T Davies, especially when he brought Doctor Who back. And he wrote a book called A Writer's Tale, which was about his time working on Doctor Who, and he talked about something called the maybe, which is that state just before you start writing a story where so many things are flickering in and out of possibility. And I think I'm in the quantum state of the maybe at the moment, where there's lots of different ideas flying around. I just need to choose one and focus on that.
I love that idea, actually. And it's led me on to another thought, and that is, I should know this, but have you written an episode of Doctor Who?
No, I would love to write an episode of Doctor Who.
You need to write an episode of Doctor Who, don't you? Let's just put that out
please,
there.
Yeah, kind of, do get in touch. I always think that The Infinite Lives of Maisie Day was, in a way, a kind of a Doctor Who script. That notion that girl waking up and opening her front door and seeing this infinite darkness outside. And if I rewrote Maisie Day as a Doctor Who episode, the next scene would probably be the Doctor appearing in the TARDIS.
It's really funny that you should say that, because that's exactly the image that I had when I read that book.
Let's get a letter writing campaign to Doctor Who start.
Yeah. Chris, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Can I just ask for teachers who'll be listening in whether there's going to be resources accompanying the book as there were for Maisie Day?
Yes, there's going to be a teaching and learning resource pack that's been done by Jenny at the Epsom Shakespeare School, so that's going to be available to download, I think, from the Noticro website. It might be coming from some teachers or some from my website, chrisfledge.co.uk as well.
Excellent. Well, we'll certainly direct people in that direction. And thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been a real pleasure.
You too, Nikki. Thank you so much.